Death Valley did not get its name by chance. In summer, temperatures at the bottom of the valley rise above 50 degrees Celsius, and the air becomes so hot that it burns the lungs when inhaled. On November 12, 2009, in one of the most remote corners of this desert, searcher Les Walker came on the radio and uttered 4 words. "Tom, we've got bones here." Next to the remains of 2 adults, at the foot of a 30-foot cliff, lay a passport, a bank card, and pages from a diary with entries in German. All of this belonged to a family of 4, 2 of whom were children. A family who, 13 years earlier, had driven into Death Valley in a hire minivan and never returned. 250 rescuers combed the canyons for 4 days, deploying helicopters, horses, and dogs. All they could find was a beer bottle, and the bones lay on the other side entirely, where this family could not have gone. But that is exactly where they went, and the reason why they chose this direction makes this story one of the most mysterious in the history of America's national parks. Egbert Rimkus was 34 years old. An architect from Dresden, he was regarded by his acquaintances as a sensible, self-assured man, accustomed to making decisions. Beside him was his girlfriend, 27-year-old Cornelia Meyer, whom her friends called Connie. Each of them had a son, 11-year-old Georg, Egbert's son from his first marriage, and 4-year-old Max, Cornelia's son. None of them had any experience of traveling through the desert. It was a typical tourist trip, one of thousands. 3 weeks in America, a hire car, a list of sights to see. They flew into Seattle on July 8, 1996, immediately transferred to a flight to Los Angeles, and hired a green Plymouth Voyager, a standard passenger minivan from Dollar Rent-A-Car. There was a hiccup during the paperwork. Egbert didn't have his driving license to hand, so Connie was registered as the main driver. The car had to be returned on 26th July. The return flight to Germany was booked for the 27th. They spent their first week on the coast, in the San Clemente area, doing the usual tourist things. Their money was, it seemed, running out. On July 12th, Egbert rang his bank in Dresden and asked them to transfer $1,500 to the Bank of America branch in San Clemente. Due to a bank error, the money was sent to the branch in Los Angeles. Later, whilst in Las Vegas, he sent a fax to his ex-wife, Heike, asking her to send additional funds. There was no reply. On July 22nd, they left Las Vegas and headed for Death Valley. It wasn't the most conventional part of the itinerary, but it wasn't crazy either. Tens of thousands of tourists visit the park every year, including in the summer, and Death Valley is particularly popular among Europeans, especially Germans. The heat is seen as part of the experience. At the Furnace Creek Visitor Center, the park's main information point, they bought 2 copies of a guidebook in German. One of these booklets was later found in the minivan. It contained marked routes, including dirt tracks leading west across the Panamint Range. On the map, one of the routes looked like a sensible way towards Yosemite, the next stop on their itinerary. It was impossible to spend the night in the valley. On that day, the thermometer at Furnace Creek Station read 123 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 51 degrees Celsius. Campsites at the bottom of the valley don't operate in such heat, and the family clearly couldn't afford a hotel. However, the side canyons running up the western slope offered quite bearable temperatures. For every 1,000 feet of ascent, the air cools by about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. They turned onto the unpaved West Side Road and drove south along the western edge of the valley. From the photographs later developed from their camera, it was established that they had spent the night of 22nd to 23rd July in Hanawa Canyon, at an altitude where the air was considerably cooler than down below. An experienced prospector named Emmett Harder, who knew the area well, recognized in one of the photographs a view of the sunset from the upper part of the canyon, the valley stretching eastwards, and the mountains on the horizon. This spot was situated approximately 27 kilometers north of the point where their car was later found. On the morning of July the 23rd, the family headed further south along West Side Road, then turned west onto the road to Warm Springs, leading to the old talc mines. And it was a well-compacted dirt track, originally built for heavy goods vehicles. It was easy to drive along it in the higher minivan. They stopped at the abandoned Warm Springs camp. Miners had once lived here, but by 1996 the camp had long been deserted. Connie left an entry in the visitor's book, the sort usually found in such places for tourists. The date, 4 names: Connie, Egbert, Georg, Max, and a note in English: "We are going through the pass." We are going through the pass. Most likely this referred to the Mengel Pass, the only route across the Panamint Range for many miles around. They drove further west to Butte Valley, a small basin nestled between the mountains. There, at the so-called geologist's hut, they stopped once more. The hut was something of a tourist shelter: a roof, walls, a little food, and nearby at Anvil Springs there was drinking water. From the hut they took a small American flag with them, which they later found in the minivan. Up to that point, everything was still going smoothly. The road was bearable. The high-altitude weather made it easy to breathe. The children were in the car, and there were still 4 days to go before the return journey. They were heading towards Mengel Pass, hoping to cross the mountain range and head west, towards Yosemite. But the Mengel Pass proved impassable for their car. It was a rocky stretch that only a 4-wheel drive off-roader with an experienced driver at the wheel could manage. The Plymouth Voyager minivan didn't stand a chance. They had to head back. The road back via Warm Springs was long, familiar, and led in the opposite direction to Yosemite. But the guidebook they'd bought at Furnace Creek mentioned another route: Anvil Canyon, heading east, back into the valley. On the map, it looked shorter. They turned into Anvil Canyon. The first 1.5 kilometers went smoothly. The canyon floor was relatively flat. But further on, the road turned into the bed of a dry stream, covered in deep sand and sharp stones. Technically, since 1994, when the area became a protected zone, driving through the canyon had been prohibited. But even if there had been no ban, a standard passenger minivan would not have been able to get through here. However, by the time this became obvious, it was already too late to turn back. The stones punctured the rear tires first, then the left front tire. The minivan kept moving because the Plymouth Voyager has front-wheel drive, and as long as at least one front tire was still holding, the car could still move. Tracks in the sand would later show that they had driven on flat tires for more than 3 kilometers before the minivan finally got stuck in the loose sand of a side branch of the riverbed. There was a spare jack and a compact spare wheel in the boot. Neither was used. With 3 punctured tires, a single spare would have made no difference. It was the evening of 23rd to July, 1996. The temperature in the canyon at that altitude, around 1,000 meters, was approximately 42 degrees. A family of 4 stood next to a minivan stuck in the sand, in a canyon where no one drove, in a park where there were almost no visitors in summer. It was about 25 kilometers as the crow flies to the nearest tarmac road. There were 4 days left until their return flight to Germany. No one knew where they were. For 3 months, no one knew they had gone missing. Egbert's ex-wife, Heike Weber, grew concerned when her son Georg failed to return from holiday on time. She began making inquiries, but the distance between Dresden and California made every step an agonizing wait. The return flight on 27th July took place without them. None of the 4 had checked in. The car hire company Dollar Rent-A-Car discovered that the minivan had not been returned on time. but in accordance with internal regulations, waited 30 days before reporting it stolen. The report was only filed with the Los Angeles Police Department on September 10th. On August 14th, Interpol issued an alert for the 4 German nationals. But in Death Valley, no one knew about this. The park is vast. There are few rangers. And in summer, when the heat makes most routes impassable, visitor numbers drop to almost zero. The minivan stood in the canyon, gathering dust, and no one saw it. On October 21st, 1996, exactly 90 days after the disappearance, National Park Ranger Dave Brenner was flying in a military helicopter over the southern part of Death Valley. It was a routine flyby. The patrol was searching for illegal drug laboratories in the remote canyons. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, Brenner spotted something below that shouldn't have been there. A car in the Anvil Canyon Channel, about 4 kilometers downstream from Willow Springs. It was strange for several reasons. There was no proper road through the canyon. Anvil Canyon had once been the only access route to the mines in Butte Valley, but after a decent dirt track was laid to the talc mines via Worm Springs, the old route through the canyon fell into disuse. In 1994, when the area was designated a conservation zone, driving through the canyon was officially banned. Locals, however, sometimes flouted the ban, but only in modified off-road vehicles. Here, however, stood an ordinary passenger minivan, which stood no chance in this canyon. Brenner got out and inspected his find. A green 1996 Plymouth Voyager with Californian number plates. A thick layer of dust covered the bodywork. The minivan was stuck in the sand up to its axles. The 2 rear tires and the left front tire were flat, and the rims were warped from driving over rocks. Tracks in the sand showed that the car had traveled more than 3 kilometers on flat tires before finally getting stuck. The doors were locked. There was no sign of the owner. Apart from Brenner's own footprints from the previous day, there were no other footprints around the vehicle. The ranger noted down the number and passed it on to park headquarters. A check with the California Highway Patrol revealed that the minivan had been reported stolen since September 10th. Owner, $rent-a-car. Renters, 4 German nationals. That very same Interpol alert. The following day, October the 22nd, park investigator Eric Inman flew to the scene in a traffic police helicopter. At around 10 o'clock in the morning, he began surveying the area around the minivan. Apart from Brenner's tracks from the previous day, no footprints were visible. 3 months of wind and sand had erased any trace of human presence. But something remained. A few food wrappers and the outlines of latrines, neatly dug into the sand some distance from the vehicle. The family had stayed here, perhaps overnight, before leaving. By 11 o'clock, Inman had returned by helicopter to the Badwater Tarmac Road, where Detective Jim Jones and Corporal Leon Boyer from the Inyo County Sheriff's Office were already waiting for him. After a briefing, the sheriff's officers set off on foot towards the minivan, whilst Inman flew back to the car at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. With the detectives present, the minivan was searched. What was inside told the story of an ordinary family trip that had been cut short. Luggage and clothes, countless children's toys, the sight of which would reduce a 4-year-old to tears. A tent, a new Coleman sleeping bag in its unopened packaging, and an empty box from a second one just like it. A tobacco pipe, a leather card holder containing bank cards in Egbert's name, Swiss bank cards and a Citicorp card, a business card for the Seahorse Resort in San Clemente, 2 unopened bottles of Bud Ice beer and 1 empty one, a bottle of bourbon, 3/4 full, several empty water and juice bottles, meaning the supply of liquids was already minimal by the time he left. A Praktica camera with several exposed 35mm rolls of film, a compact spare tire, and a jack, neither of which had been used, and a small American flag bearing the inscription, Butte Valley Stone Cabin, taken from the geologist's cabin. The film from the camera was later developed. The photographs captured a typical tourist trip: the coast, Las Vegas, and views of Death Valley. It was from these photographs that prospector Emmett Harder, who knew the area like the back of his hand, identified one of the sunset views as having been taken from the top of Hanupa Canyon. This confirmed that the family had spent the night of 22nd to 23rd July there. At the same time, the park headquarters retrieved the visitor logs that rangers regularly collect along the trails. In the Worm Springs camp log, an entry dated July 23rd was found. The handwriting was uneven but legible. Connie, Egbert, Georg, Max. We are going through the pass. Bore names and a direction of travel. It was the last entry left by any of them. The minivan was towed out of the canyon on October the 23rd and taken to the impound in Lone Pine. At 10 a.m. on 23rd October, a full-scale search operation began. The China Lake Mountain Rescue Team arrived on the scene. This volunteer unit specializes in mountain and desert rescue operations and is regarded as one of the best in this part of the country. They were joined by 9 trackers from the Indian Wells Valley Search and Rescue Team and 8 mounted officers from the Kern County Sheriff's Mounted Search and Rescue Unit. On the first day, they combed through a large section of Anvil Canyon, heading east from the car towards its mouth. There, about 2.5 kilometers down the canyon from the minivan, members of the China Lake team discovered the only clue from the entire 4-day search: a bottle of Bud Ice beer stuck in the sand next to a bush. The brand matched the beer found in the minivan. Near the bottle, someone had cleared a space on a rocky ledge and sat down, leaving a clear imprint of a large body in the sand. The size of the imprint suggested an adult male, presumably Egbert. The spot was on the eastern side of the bush, meaning it was in the shade cast by the bush as the sun set. At the end of the day, whoever had been sitting here was looking eastwards. From this vantage point, there was a view down the canyon to its mouth, and beyond that, some 25 kilometers away, the Badwater asphalt road was visible on the opposite side of the valley. If one turned one's head south beyond a low ridge of hills, one could make out a gentle slope that looked passable on foot. This place looked like a spot where a person would have been thinking through a plan. Where to go? Where to seek help? On the second day, October 24th, additional teams joined the effort. Rescue workers from Nye County in Nevada and from Inyo County. The search area was expanded. They combed the Worm Springs Road, the Butte Valley Basin, the approaches to Mengle Pass, the area from the mouth of the canyon to the tarmac of Westside Road, and from the minivan westwards to Willow Springs. 2 helicopters worked continuously, ferrying people and equipment and conducting aerial surveys. On the third day, the search area was expanded further. The park team combed the plain between the mouth of the canyon and Badwater Road. Rescuers from Victorville surveyed the southeastern edge of Butte Valley. A ranger from the Bureau of Land Management began checking the route west of Mengle Pass, between the abandoned town of Ballarat and Barker Ranch. A team from Lake Mead National Recreation Area crossed north from Anvil Canyon, over the mountains, and descended into Butte Valley. The Indian Wells team conducted a detailed survey of the Willow Springs Spring in the upper reaches of the canyon. The China Lake Mountain Rescue Team started from the middle of the canyon and moved north, then west. On the 4th day, October 26th, the search reached its widest scope. Abandoned mines were checked, as the missing person might have taken shelter from the sun there, or fallen into a shaft. The stripped Butte area in Butte Valley was searched. They surveyed the approaches to Westside Road, where tracks might have been preserved in the ground. A mobile search party from Apple Valley, which had just arrived, checked sections of Westside Road north of the turnoff to Warm Springs. Helicopters flew over all 4 sides of the canyon, including the southern side, but strong winds limited visibility and the effectiveness of the aerial search. By the evening of October 26th, after 4 days of searching, the operation was called off. More than 45 rescuers were working in the field at the same time. 2 helicopters in the air, 8 horses on the ground. The total cost amounted to around $80,000. According to a park representative, around 250 people took part in the operation. The search areas had been chosen wisely, and the chances of a discovery were considered high. But nothing was found apart from a beer bottle. 4 people, 2 of whom were children, disappeared in a canyon in the middle of the desert, and over the course of 4 days, the region's best search teams were unable to find any bodies, clothing, tracks, or any indication of the direction in which the family had gone from their car. It was precisely this emptiness that was the most peculiar thing. Search operations in the desert usually yield results quickly. In a dry climate, bodies mummify rather than decompose. Bones, skin, and clothing remain intact for decades. Metal objects glint in the sun and are visible from a helicopter. 4 people walking across open terrain must have left a noticeable trail. A lost shoe, a discarded bottle, torn fabric, footprints in soft ground. Something. But the canyon and all the surrounding areas that had been searched were clean. It was as if the family had got into a minivan and vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a single beer bottle under a bush. There was one detail that continued to puzzle both the investigators and the search party. Just over 4 kilometers west of the spot where the minivan had become stuck, stood the geologist's hut, the very place from which the family had taken the flag. Next to the hut was Anvil Springs, a spring with drinking water. Inside the hut was a small supply of food. The family knew about this place. They had only just been there that very day. It was the nearest spot offering water and shelter, familiar and safe. But they did not return there. Instead, judging by the sole piece of evidence, one of them, most likely Egbert, walked nearly 3 kilometers in the opposite direction, eastward, down the canyon, sat down under a bush and drank beer whilst looking out over the scorching valley. This behavior was illogical for someone in an emergency. He was moving away from the water towards the heat. Either he did not consider the situation an emergency, or he had a plan that seemed better to him than returning to the hut. There were other questions that no one could answer. Why had they locked the car? People in an emergency usually leave their car unlocked, in case someone drives past and looks inside. The locked doors suggested that the family may not have perceived what was happening as an emergency. They had locked the hire minivan, just as one would lock a car in a supermarket car park, out of habit, out of a sense of tidiness, with the intention of returning in a few hours. A sleeping bag in its unopened box, some toys, a jack, a spare tire, half a bottle of bourbon. All of this had been left in the car. Empty water and juice bottles suggested that their supply of liquids was almost exhausted. They hadn't prepared for a long-term survival situation. They were only going away for a short while, hoping to return or find help that would get them back to the car. Another fact gave pause for thought. Willow Springs was situated just 4 kilometers west of the minivan, further up the canyon. It was the second water source within reach, apart from Anvil Springs near the geologist's hut. Search parties had examined both springs thoroughly. No traces of the family's presence were found at either. They had passed the water twice in both directions, and had never stopped. In the years that followed, the search continued sporadically. The Chain Lake Mountain Rescue Team returned to the Anvil Canyon area on numerous occasions to check abandoned mine shafts into which a person might have fallen. Private search parties and individuals also visited, but their efforts were less systematic and less well documented. Among the most persistent were Dick Hasselman, a retired professor at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, and Emmett Harder, a prospector who had worked for many years in the Butte Valley area. Both undertook several independent expeditions and compiled detailed reports on their findings, or more accurately, on the complete lack thereof. Thanks to his connections with the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, Harder gained access to the developed photographs from the family's camera. The pictures showed typical tourist scenes: beaches, casinos, mountain views. No alarming details, no signs of conflict or fear. The final shots, apparently taken in Death Valley, showed the family in high spirits. The people in these photographs had no idea that their trip was coming to an end. Time passed. The investigation looked into other theories. Perhaps Egbert had faked his disappearance to escape his debts. The documents mentioned Costa Rica as a possible escape route, but no evidence was found to suggest that any of the four had left the United States. Not a single bank card had been used since July 23rd. Not a single passport had been presented at any border crossing in the world. The theory of flight hung in the air, unsupported by anything other than the fact of financial difficulties. The authorities' official line was that it was an accident. The family had died from overheating and dehydration, in other words, from hyperthermia. But this explanation, for all its medical accuracy, left the key question unanswered. If they had died in the desert, where were the bodies? The desert does not hide the dead. It preserves them. 4 people cannot vanish without a trace in a rocky canyon that has been combed by 250 rescuers. With each passing year, the case sank deeper into the category of unsolved. Anvil Canyon returned to its usual state: silence, sand, the occasional shadow cast by the rocks, and the whistling of the wind through the narrow passages. Occasionally, a helicopter would fly past on a patrol. Occasionally, a tourist would wander in. No one found anything else. The Death Valley Germans case, as it came to be known in the press and on internet forums, has become one of those stories that are retold on hiking trips and dissected on forums for enthusiasts of unsolved mysteries, yet which no one knows how to approach anymore. For 13 years, the minivan stood in the impound lot in Lone Pine. For 13 years, 4 names remained on the federal missing persons database. For 13 years, the bones lay somewhere in the desert, and the desert remained silent. Over the course of 13 years, several theories have emerged regarding the case, each of which explains some of the facts, but none of which explain them all. The official version of the investigation was simple, and at first glance, convincing. The family died of hyperthermia, that is, from overheating and dehydration. On July 23rd, the temperature in the canyon reached 42 degrees at the altitude where the minivan was parked, and was even higher further down the canyon, closer to the valley floor. Under such conditions, the human body loses up to a liter of water per hour during physical exertion. The family's water supply was minimal. The empty water bottles in the minivan suggested that there was almost nothing left to drink even before they left the vehicle. 4 people, 2 of whom were small children, without water, without shelter, in the desert at the height of summer. The outcome was inevitable. The evidence supporting this version of events was compelling. There were no indications of a violent crime, no signs of a struggle, no damage to the minivan, and no suspicious circumstances. The area was so remote that a chance encounter with another person in July was virtually impossible. Crime in this part of Death Valley was limited to the occasional illegal laboratory, and none had been discovered near Anvil Canyon. But this theory had a flaw that continued to trouble both search teams and investigators: the absence of bodies. If the family had perished from the heat somewhere in the canyon or the surrounding area, 250 people should have found them within 4 days. The desert does not hide remains. It preserves them. Clothing, footwear, and metal objects remain visible for years, even decades. 4 bodies in open or semi-open terrain, in an area combed by foot patrols, mounted units, and helicopters, should have been found. But they were nowhere to be found, neither in the canyon nor to the east of it, nor to the west, nor to the north. There was one direction left, which in 1996 had been checked only from the air and only on the very last day in strong winds: the south. The second theory, which was considered in the early stages of the investigation, concerned the possibility that the incident had been staged. Egbert was experiencing financial difficulties. He had twice tried unsuccessfully to obtain money from Germany during his trip. Some reports suggested that he might have been planning to flee his debts, possibly to Latin America. In this scenario, the family did not leave the minivan because they were in trouble, but because Egbert deliberately abandoned the vehicle in a remote canyon to create the appearance of a fatal accident and took the family away by another route. Critics of this version have pointed to several fundamental problems. None of the 4 passports had been presented at any border anywhere in the world since 23rd of July, 1996. No bank cards had been used. No medical facility, school, or employer in any country had recorded the arrival of people with these names. Faking one's own disappearance whilst in a foreign country with 2 small children, limited cash, and no local support would have been an operation of such complexity that it was hardly consistent with the image of an architect from Dresden who could not afford a hotel in Furnace Creek. The escape theory did exist, but as the years passed and no trace of the 4 emerged, it became increasingly implausible. The third version, the most detailed and well-founded, appeared much later and was put forward by the man who eventually found the answer. Tom Mahood was an engineer and an experienced search and rescue worker with the RMRU, the Riverside County Mountain Rescue Unit. In the early 2000s, he became interested in the case of the Germans of Death Valley, began systematically studying the case files and visiting the Anvil Canyon area. Mahood applied an engineering approach to the mystery. If all the areas surveyed had yielded no results, then the answer must lie in an area that had not been surveyed. He began with a question that, it would seem, was obvious. Why did the family not return to the geologist's cabin, where there was water and shelter? Mahood suggested that the family did not view their situation as a struggle for survival. For them, it was a transport problem. The car had got stuck, and they needed to find someone to help pull it out so they could make their flight on July 27th. The geologist's hut offered water and shelter, but no solution. There were no people, no telephone, and no transport there. Returning to the hut meant waiting, and there was no one to wait for. It might be weeks before anyone passed along this road. Mahood then asked himself, where might Egbert have gone if he was looking not for shelter, but for people? He studied the maps available to the family and noticed a detail that was obvious to an American, but not to a European. On the map, 13 to 15 kilometers south of Anvil Canyon, the boundary of the China Lake Naval Air Station, one of the largest military installations in California, was marked. In Germany, as in most European countries, a military base means a perimeter fence, checkpoints, and regular patrols by armed guards. This is what Egbert grew up with, what he has seen all his life. For him, the boundary of a military base was synonymous with the presence of people. People who have transport, communications, and the ability to help. But military bases in the deserts of the southwestern United States are organized differently. Their territories are so vast that it is physically impossible to fence off the perimeter. Security is provided not by fences, but by the desert itself. Hundreds of square kilometers of scorched earth that no one would willingly traverse. There are no border patrols. There are no checkpoints. There is nothing but the occasional signpost and endless space. Egbert didn't know that. He couldn't have known. It was the one piece of information that stood between a sensible decision and a fatal mistake. According to Mahood, events unfolded as follows after the minivan became stuck. Towards the evening of 23rd to July, Egbert likely walked about 2.5 kilometers east along the canyon to the very bush where the bottle was later found. He sat down in the shade, drank a beer, and looked around. From this vantage point, he could see eastwards, down the canyon, to the very bottom of the valley, where the temperature was deadly. He could see the Badwater asphalt road on the other side, but between him and the road lay 25 kilometers of hellish heat. He could look south and see a low ridge of hills, beyond which, according to the map, the military base began. The distance to the base's perimeter was 13 to 15 kilometers. The ascent southwards appeared gentle and passable. The temperature at altitude was considerably lower than at the bottom of the valley. To someone who was certain that soldiers would be waiting for him at the base's perimeter with a radio and water, this route seemed the best of all the options. Mahood surmised that Egbert had returned to the minivan, that the family had spent the night in or near the vehicle, and that early on the morning of July 24th, they had locked the doors, taken only the bare essentials with them, and set off on foot towards the south. They passed the bush with the bottle, climbed up one of the side ravines heading south, and emerged onto a high plateau from where they saw for the first time what lay beyond the ridge of hills. There was no fence, no patrols, nor any signs of human presence, only emptiness stretching to the horizon. By this point, they had apparently begun to realize that the situation was more serious than it had seemed. But turning back meant returning to the car, where there was neither water nor any hope of help. Perhaps Egbert had left Connie and the children in some sort of shelter and gone on alone. Perhaps they were all walking together. It was impossible to say for certain. It was the southern scenario that led Mahood to that spot in the desert where no rescuer had ever been before. In early November 2009, Mahood persuaded his colleague from the mountain rescue team, Les Walker, to join him on an expedition south of Anvil Canyon. They notified the park authorities and the China Lake Mountain Rescue Team of their plans, and took a personal radio beacon with them in case of an emergency. Walker set up a satellite tracker that transmitted their coordinates in real time to a web page accessible to relatives and colleagues. On November 11th, they set off from Riverside, and by midday had begun their descent into Anvil Canyon. Walker wanted to see the spot where the minivan had been parked, and the bush with the bottle. From there, they turned south and headed for Squaw Springs, the only place in the area where they could replenish their water supplies. The climb was arduous, their rucksacks were full, and the terrain was rocky. At the spring, they filled a collapsible canister with a capacity of about 10 liters, and Mahood stuffed it into his rucksack, bringing its weight up to 30 kilograms. The rest of the journey south towards the high plateau, which Mahood considered the key search area, took several more hours over rough terrain. By 4:30 in the evening, when it had grown dark, they set up camp on the edge of the plateau. On the morning of the 12th of November, they left their main equipment at camp and set off southwards with only light packs, combing the western edge of the plateau. They walked a few hundred meters apart, keeping in touch via radio. The terrain was rocky, with sparse scrub and sheer cliffs. One of the few people ever to have seen this landscape was the mountaineer Pete Carlson, who later visited the site of the discovery and said it was the most remote place he had ever been. At around 8 in the morning, they reached the southwestern corner of the plateau, where one of the 3 possible routes further south began. There were no signs of human passage. They turned east, moving along the southern edge. Mahood climbed up to the saddle in the hills, the second possible passage to the south, whilst Walker followed the bottom of the gully at the foot of the hills. At 8:43, the radio came to life. Walker reported that he had found a wine bottle. Mahood noted this as a potentially significant find. Fragments of the label remained on the bottle, which was unusual for an object that had been lying in the sun for 13 years. Then Walker reported that he could see something resembling toilet paper in the bushes. On closer inspection, it turned out to be pages from a diary with text in German. Then, a few minutes later, a phrase was uttered that drew a line under 13 years of uncertainty. "Tom, we've got bones here." Mahood descended from the saddle. By 9:14 a.m., he had reached the spot. At the foot of a vertical cliff, about 10 meters high and facing north, white fragments were scattered across an area of roughly 150 meters. Nearby, Walker found a wallet containing documents. All the identification was in the name of Cornelia Meyer, a passport and a bank card with a photograph. Over the next hour, they carefully examined the scene, taking care not to disturb anything. In addition to a 2-liter wine bottle and Connie's documents, they found a toothbrush, a tube of some sort of ointment or toothpaste, and pages from Connie's diary containing business cards from the places the family had stayed during their trip. In a small side gully, the sole of a small shoe was discovered, which could have belonged to either a woman or a child. About 20 meters further down the gully lay a clear bottle, which was later identified as a Bud Ice bottle, matching those found in the minivan. The rock at the foot of which the remains lay cast a shadow for much of the day. It was the only shelter from the sun for many hundreds of meters around. They had come here to escape the heat, and they stayed here. In December 2009, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office organized an official expedition to the site to recover remains and evidence. On the 4th, 5th, and 6th of December, a team comprising rescue workers, forensic scientists, and sheriff's officers worked at the site. Conditions were harsh, but of a very different nature to those in July. Nighttime temperatures dropped to -7 degrees Celsius, and the water in the canisters froze. Bone fragments were recovered which, according to preliminary findings, belonged to 2 adults, a man and a woman. DNA analysis subsequently confirmed that the male remains belonged to Egbert Rimkus. It was not possible to obtain DNA confirmation for the female remains, but Cornelia's documents, found nearby, left little room for doubt. No remains of children were officially found. According to some reports, bone fragments were found at the site which the search team considered to be similar to those of children, but no official conclusion was reached. The sole of a small shoe found in a side gully could have belonged to one of the boys, but it could also have been a girl's. The fate of Gorg and Max remains formally unconfirmed. Sheriff's Office spokesperson Karma Roper told reporters that the authorities were almost certain the remains belonged to the missing tourists. No further searches were planned. The case was, in effect, closed. The cause of death had been established as an accident, heat stroke, and dehydration. Cornelia's father, upon hearing of the discovery, expressed his immense gratitude to the search team. For 13 years, his daughter, grandson, and their companions had been listed as missing, and the family had lived in a limbo between hope and grief, unable to fully embrace either. Now, at least, there was certainty. Tom Mahood has published a detailed account of his search on his personal website. The text, divided into several chapters and featuring photographs, maps, and GPS coordinates, has become one of the most widely read accounts of disappearances in national parks. Mahood described not only the chronology of his expeditions, but also the reasoning that led him to the southern scenario, a chain of decisions, each of which seemed reasonable in isolation, but which together led the family to their deaths. This line of reasoning can be broken down into a few key points. They drove along the dirt track because the map showed it was the shortest route. They turned into the canyon because the guidebook indicated there was a road there. They didn't stop when the tires blew out because the front-wheel drive car was still moving. They locked the car and walked away because they thought they would return. They didn't go back to the hut because the hut didn't solve their problem. They headed south because there was a military base on the map, and a military base meant people. Every step seemed logical. None of them was dictated by stupidity, recklessness, or indifference to danger. It was a series of honest mistakes made by people who lacked one single piece of knowledge: that in the American desert, military bases are not like German ones. Mahood wrote about this quite openly. He believed that, had he found himself in the same situation, he might well have made the same mistakes, had he not known what he knew. In this instance, the difference between life and death was determined not by character or training, but by information. The story attracted considerable attention. It was covered by major news outlets and discussed on podcasts and forums dedicated to unsolved cases. The podcast Stuff You Should Know devoted an entire episode to it. Interactive maps showing the family's route and the locations where items were found appeared on mapping platforms. The Death Valley Germans case has become part of the unofficial canon of stories about how America's wilderness kills those who underestimate its scale. But even after the discovery in 2009, there were still questions that remained unanswered. Why didn't the family return to the geologist's hut, where there was water and a roof? Mahood's theory offers a rational explanation, but it is just that, a theory, not an established fact. No one knows for certain what Egbert was thinking as he sat under a bush with a bottle of beer, gazing southwards. What happened to the children? Their remains have never been officially identified. Search teams reported finding bone fragments resembling those of children, but no official conclusion has been reached. 4-year-old Max and 11-year-old Georg remain formally listed in the missing persons database. Did they have even a minimal supply of water when they left the car? The empty containers in the minivan suggest that, in all likelihood, they didn't. But of course, nobody really knows for sure. And finally, did they all head south together? Or did Egbert leave his family in hiding and set off alone to seek help? The rock where the remains were found looks like a place where someone tried to shelter from the sun and wait. But there was no one to wait for. There wasn't a soul to be seen for dozens of kilometers to the south. German-language guidebooks are still on sale in Death Valley National Park. Anvil Canyon remains closed to traffic, and few visitors to the park are even aware of its existence. The Willow Springs Spring still flows. The geologist's cabin still stands in Butte Valley, stocked with food and flying an American flag that someone hung up to replace the one that was stolen. And a few kilometers to the south, beyond a range of low hills, on a rocky plateau that most people will never see, stands a rock face about 10 meters high, facing north. At its foot lies a dry gully, sparse bushes, and a patch of shade that offers a few hours respite from the sun in July. Further south lies a vast emptiness, scorched plains stretching towards the boundary of a military base that is indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. No fence, no patrols, not a single sign of human presence for many kilometers around. On July 23, 1996, Connie left an entry in the guest book of an abandoned camp. 4 names in a single sentence. We're crossing the pass. They didn't make it across, but they were on their way. The Coral Sea is considered one of the most beautiful in the world. Turquoise waters, reefs, and tropical islands on the horizon. But tourist brochures make no mention of the sea's greatest mystery. In 1872, the brig Mary Celeste was discovered. The ship was sailing under partial sail, the cargo was intact, and the crew was missing. Over the past century and a half, this has become the benchmark for maritime mysteries, a story against which all similar cases are measured. And so, in April 2007, 3 Australians set out from Airlie Beach on a catamaran to circumnavigate the country's coastline. 3 days later, their vessel was found drifting 88 miles from the shore. The 3 men had vanished, leaving not a single trace of a struggle, no distress signal, nor a note Their life jackets lay untouched. Their inflatable dinghy was secured at the stern. The coroner will call it an accident, but his own report will begin with the admission that, in truth, he still does not understand exactly what happened there. Derek Batten, known to his friends as Dez, was a carpet fitter. He was 56 years old, lived in Perth with his wife Jennifer, and led the unhurried life of a semi-professional tradesperson who took on jobs when he fancied it and turned them down when he didn't. At the age of 50, he had suffered a heart attack, after which he took medication for diabetes and high cholesterol. A man who, by all accounts, should have been spending his retirement by the sea. Instead, in 2006, Batten bought a catamaran. The vessel was called Kaz 2, 9.8 meters long, with 2 hulls and a diesel engine, built in 1980. He paid $80,000 for it. The seller, Graham Douglas, handed over the boat in good condition and gave him some advice which Batten remembered, but, judging by subsequent events, did not fully appreciate. Batten had completed courses in coastal navigation, radio communications, and first aid. He had sailed the Kaz 2 twice to the Whitsunday Islands, off the east coast of Australia, returning safely on both occasions. This was sufficient for short coastal trips. However, in Douglas's view, it was not enough for what he had in mind next. The plan was ambitious: to sail the catamaran from Queensland around the northern coast of Australia and back to Perth. The journey would take 6, perhaps 8 weeks. Initially, Batten had intended to set off with his wife, but then he decided that 2 people on board were not enough to ensure safety, so he invited his neighbors along. Brothers Peter and James Tansted lived across the road from the Battens in a suburb of Perth. Peter was 69, James 63. Both were retired. In their youth, they had sailed small boats and for a time worked as radio operators in the Voluntary Sea Rescue Service. But they had never captained large vessels on the open sea, and significantly, Peter could not swim. 3 men, whom the Australian press would later describe as typical Australian blokes, had been preparing for the voyage for several months. Every day, they discussed the details, plotting their course on a computer, planning stops, agreeing not to sail at night, and to stay closer to the shore. Batten fitted the catamaran with solar panels and fishing gear to ensure self-sufficiency during the long voyage. For added security, he placed a .44 caliber rifle in a locked container under the bed. Graham Douglas, the previous owner, watched the preparations. During questioning, he would later say that he had seen 3 men struggling to get to grips with the ship's navigation system, and that the sight did not inspire confidence. According to him, he warned Batten directly, "Do not venture beyond the Whitsunday Islands. Beyond the archipelago lay the open coral sea, and your experience was not sufficient for that." Batten listened. The men, according to Douglas's recollection, looked nervous but determined to set sail. On the 14th of April, 2007, the Kaz 2 was due to set sail from Shoal Harbour, near Airlie Beach in Queensland. The first leg of the journey, 270 kilometers north to Townsville. From there, along the coast to the west and on, around the entire continent, back home. The departure did not go ahead. The crew encountered problems with the GPS. The system refused to work properly. It turned out to be a user error, which was successfully resolved, but the day was lost. The following morning, Sunday, April 15th, the Kaz 2 finally set sail from Airlie Beach. It was around 10 o'clock. The weather had been relatively calm since the morning, but heavy clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Later, the meteorological services would record wind gusts of up to 26 miles per hour in the area. An hour and a half after setting sail, one of the crew members phoned his wife. The conversation was brief and routine. There was nothing in it to suggest any cause for concern or trouble. This was the last confirmed contact with his family. At 10:05 in the morning, James Tanstead filmed a short video clip. The footage shows Batten standing at the helm, the catamaran sailing under sail. Peter Tanstead is sitting on the stern ladder fishing, with the safety railing next to him lowered. A long white rope trails behind the boat. Fenders, soft cylindrical bumpers, hung over the sides to provide protection when mooring at a jetty or another vessel, hang from the gunwales on both sides. The sea is rough. None of the three are wearing life jackets. In the shot, the men can be heard discussing the weather on the horizon. The sky ahead looks threatening. The camera rotates 360 degrees. The islands of Grassy, Gambrel, and Armit are visible. Using these landmarks, investigators will later determine the exact location of the catamaran at the time the footage was taken. James Tanstead's t-shirt and sunglasses are not in the same place in the footage as where they will later be found, which means he moved them after filming had finished. The recording cuts off. No one turned the camera back on. Volunteer radio operator Ivan Orms would later state that at 18:45 that same day, he received a radio message from CAS 2 reporting a position in the George Point area. The journey from Airlie Beach to George Point takes around 2.5 hours. What the crew were doing all that time remains unclear. One explanation is that they were simply fishing all day. Another is that they encountered navigation problems once again. GPS data retrieved later from the onboard system will show that on the morning of the 15th of April, the catamaran was heading northeast, towards the growing swell. By the afternoon, however, its coordinates began to fluctuate erratically. No one was at the helm anymore. It was adrift. On the 16th of April, the following day, the fishing vessel Gillian spotted a white catamaran drifting aimlessly on the water. Its sail was torn. The crew of the Gillian did not contact the Coast Guard and did not approach it. They continued on their way. Another 2 days passed. On April 18th, a rescue service helicopter conducting a routine patrol of the Great Barrier Reef waters spotted the CAS 2 drifting 88 nautical miles northeast of Townsville. The pilot reported that the crew might be in distress. However, it was not until April 20th, 2 days after the discovery, that they were able to approach the vessel and board it. When the rescuers climbed onto the deck, they were met with a scene that Emergency Response Officer John Hall summed up a single sentence. It looked as though the boat had only just been abandoned. The engine was running in neutral. The light was on in the cabin. The navigation instruments were switched on, and the radio was in working order. A newspaper lay open on the table in the saloon. Next to it stood a box containing fishing knives in a plastic case. The knives looked as though they hadn't been used for a long time. There were several oil knives in the sink. A blue coffee mug was found on one of the benches, next to a lifebuoy. Every single life jacket was in its designated place. The inflatable dinghy was secured at the stern in its stowed position. The anchor had been raised. Wallets, passports, and the vessel's documents were all in their proper places. A .44 caliber rifle and ammunition were stored in a sealed container under Batten's bed. Another cartridge of the same caliber was found in a drawer. None of the valuables were missing. From the outside, the picture was quite different. The staysail, the forward triangular sail, had been torn to shreds. The fabric hung in tatters from the stay, the forward rope running from the mast to the bow. The coaming still hung from the gunwales on both sides. And there was one more detail that the rescuers noticed immediately. A fishing lure, a metal bait used for trolling, had become tangled around the catamaran's port rudder. Rescue Officer Corey Benson, one of the first to board the vessel, later admitted during questioning that his greatest fear at that moment was encountering someone who did not want him on board. He climbed the stern ladder, hearing only the steady hum of the diesel engine idling and the flapping of the torn sail in the wind. Inside the cabin, it was silent. The lights were on, the instruments were running, and the ventilation system was blowing warm air through the saloon. The scene looked so untouched that it seemed as though the crew had stepped away for a moment and were about to return. Benson checked every compartment and peered into every locker. There was no one on board. The search and rescue operation began on the same day, the 18th of April. Coordination was handled by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, which also provided the aerial component, whilst the Queensland Water Police were responsible for the maritime aspect. A naval aircraft was the first to head for the area where the catamaran was believed to be drifting, and began surveying the waters around the vessel's last known position. At the same time, volunteer rescue teams from several coastal towns launched a search along the coastline and amongst the islands. During the night, a plane equipped with infrared equipment was sent into the air. It scanned the reefs and coral islets where a person might theoretically have managed to reach dry land and wait for help. The following day, the operation was in full swing. On April 19th, the search area was covered by 2 rescue helicopters from the Queensland Emergency Response Service, 9 aircraft, including naval and civilian aircraft, 4 volunteer rescue vessels, and a Townsville Water Police boat. The area covered around 700 square nautical miles, approximately 2,400 square kilometers of open water, reef systems, and coastal areas. GPS data was retrieved from the CAS-2 onboard system. Using this data, the route was reconstructed. On the morning of April the 15th, the catamaran was heading steadily northeast, but by late afternoon on the same day, it had ceased to move in a specific direction. This data narrowed down the search area, but did not answer the main question. At exactly what point did the crew end up in the water, and how far could they have drifted in 3 or 4 days? Dr. Paul Lakin, an expert in open sea survival, was brought in to assist with the investigation. His conclusion was clear. If the men had ended up in the water on the 15th of April without any life-saving equipment, the chances of them still being alive by the 19th were virtually nil. But there remained a hope that one of them might have reached land, one of the islands or reef shoals scattered across the waters of the Great Barrier Reef. Search teams continued their work. Planes flew low over the water. Helicopters hovered over every suspicious spot on the surface, and boats combed through the search areas, taking into account the direction of the currents and wind strength from the previous days. On the 20th of April, the CAS-2 was towed to Townsville Harbor and placed in a dry dock for a forensic examination. The work was carried out by Sergeants Paul Malloy and Shane Bardell of the Queensland Police, in conjunction with maritime experts. The examination lasted several hours. The catamaran's hull was structurally intact. No damage from the collision, no holes. The holds were dry. No signs of flooding were found. The emergency communication systems were in working order, but none of them had been activated. Neither the emergency radio beacon, nor the handheld flare gun, nor the ship's radio in distress mode. Forensic experts searched for signs of intruders, fingerprints, shoe prints, and biological samples. Nothing was found on board that pointed to anyone other than the 3 crew members. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no damage to the furniture or equipment, apart from that which, as was later established, occurred during towing. A few magazines, a scrap of newspaper, and a bag of wine had slipped onto the floor whilst being transported to the port. But otherwise, the cabin remained in the same state in which the crew had left it. Sergeant Malloy subsequently stated during questioning that he had found no grounds to suspect a crime. When asked by Peter Tanstead's widow, Frances, why the police had not carried out a full fingerprint analysis, he replied that his many years of experience suggested there was no need to do so. According to him, they had spent a long time on the vessel, had searched it thoroughly, and had found nothing suspicious. If there had been even the slightest sign of violent activity, They would have used every available method, but Malloy was one of the few who felt confident in these conclusions. For the details discovered on board painted a picture that defied simple logic. The cabin looked as though the crew were about to have lunch or had already finished. There was a newspaper on the table, knives in the sink, and a mug on the bench. But if lunch had been interrupted suddenly, why was everything so tidy? Where were the signs of haste, the overturned crockery, the scattered belongings? The life jackets remained in their holders. If the men had faced danger at sea, deteriorating weather conditions, or the risk of falling overboard, the first thing any sailor, even an inexperienced one, would do is put on a life jacket. They did not do this. This means that either the danger arose so suddenly that there was no time to react, or at the moment when it all happened, they did not believe they were in any danger. The dinghy was secured at the stern. If the crew had left the vessel of their own accord, why would they have left their only means of escape on board? If they were taken by force, who did it, and why were neither valuables nor weapons touched? The fenders, hung on both sides of the ship, attracted particular attention. Fenders, soft inflatable or padded cylinders, are hung alongside the ship to protect the hull when mooring alongside a quay or another vessel. Out at sea, they are usually stowed away. Batten's niece, Hope Heeming, pointed this out directly. The only reason fenders are hung out is because another vessel is approaching, or the boat is approaching the quay. Townsville police countered that on small boats, fenders are often left hanging out permanently, out of laziness or habit. A video recording taken by the crew on the morning of April 15th confirmed that the fenders were already hanging on the railings at the time of filming, even before anything had happened. This could mean that the men had simply forgotten to stow them away when leaving the marina. But it could have meant something else. A fishing lure that had become entangled in the port side steering gear proved to be one of the key pieces of evidence. If someone from the crew was fishing from the stern and the line got caught in the steering mechanism, the logical thing to do would have been to try to free it. To do this, one would have had to lean over the stern or go down to the water. On a rough sea, without a life jacket and with the safety railing lowered, this was dangerous. The video footage showed exactly this. Peter Tansted was sitting on the stern ladder, fishing. The guardrail next to him was lowered. He wasn't wearing a life jacket, and Peter Tansted couldn't swim. The deeper the investigation delved into the circumstances of the case, the more tangled the web of inconsistencies became. The torn staysail suggested strong winds or a sudden change in wind direction. But if the wind had been strong enough to tear the sail, why was the cabin still intact? The items on the table hadn't budged. The mug was standing upright, not lying on its side. A storm capable of destroying a sail would leave traces inside the vessel too. There were none here. The GPS data raised further questions. According to the records, the catamaran was maintaining a steady northeasterly course until a certain point in the afternoon of April 15th, after which it began to drift. But radio operator Ivan Orms claimed that he received a message from CAS 2 at 1845, when according to the GPS, the vessel was no longer under control. If Orms is right, then someone was on board and made contact after the drift began. If the GPS data is correct, then Orms's report is either incorrect or belongs to another vessel. The timing didn't add up either. The journey from Airlie Beach to George Point, from where, according to Orms, the last signal was received, takes about 2.5 hours. The catamaran set sail at 10 o'clock in the morning. The radio transmission was recorded at 6:45 p.m. What was the crew doing for over 8 hours? Fishing? Struggling with navigation? Facing a problem they didn't report? James Tansted's t-shirt and glasses also raised questions. In the video footage taken at 10:05 a.m., they were lying in one place. When forensic officers examined the vessel, the same items were found in a different spot. James must have moved them at some point after filming had finished. Why did he take off his t-shirt? Why did he remove his glasses? Was he feeling hot, or was he preparing for something that required freedom of movement, such as leaning over the water to untangle the fishing line on the tiller? The fishing vessel Gillian, which had spotted the drifting catamaran as early as April 16th, 2 days before it was officially discovered, did not approach it or raise the alarm. Had the Gillian's crew contacted the Coast Guard that same day, the search would have begun 48 hours earlier. In the waters of the Coral Sea, with its currents and temperatures, 48 hours could have meant the difference between life and death. But the Gillian sailed past, and then there were another 2 days between the helicopter spotting the catamaran on the 18th of April and the rescue team boarding it on the 20th. 2 days during which the Kaz 2 continued to drift unattended, whilst its crew, if any of them were still clinging to the water or a patch of land, remained without help. The controversy surrounding the lunch on the table became a topic of its own. Initial press reports painted a picture of an interrupted meal. Plates, cutlery, food. Emergency Services Officer John Hall confirmed in an interview that cutlery had been laid out on the table. However, the coroner's report mentions only a newspaper in the saloon. Some researchers of the case believe that the food on the table may have been a journalistic myth, built upon the actual facts and lending the story an additional air of mystery. It is now impossible to determine where the line lies between what was actually on the table and what was placed there by the reporters' imaginations. There was also a theory about a sandbank. The George Point area, from where the last radio signal was received, is known for its shallow waters. If the catamaran had run aground, the crew might have tried to push it back into the water by jumping overboard. A sudden gust of wind could have carried the lighter vessel away, leaving the men in the water with no way of returning. This theory would explain why towels were drying on deck. However, the GPS data did not record a halt characteristic of running aground, and this hypothesis was not confirmed. April in this part of the Coral Sea is the season for waterspouts, columns of water that form above the surface and can strike without warning. They occur close to the shore, precisely in the area where Kaz 2 was located, and are powerful enough to tear a sail, knock people off the deck, and even trigger the quick-release fastenings of the life raft. Meteorological records for April 15th did not record a waterspout in this area. But waterspouts over the water often go unreported because there is simply no one to observe them. On April 21st, at 4 p.m., the air and sea search was officially called off. Dr. Lakin confirmed his assessment. If the men had been in the water since April 15th, they could not have been alive by that point. The currents, the water temperature, the lack of life-saving equipment, their physical condition. Batten had diabetes and had suffered a heart attack, whilst Peter Tonstad was unable to swim, all pointed to a single outcome. On 23rd of April, following the receipt of new information, the nature of which was not disclosed to the public, another search was conducted along the coast. This too proved fruitless. On April 25th, the search operation was finally called off. The families of the missing men did not give up. In early May, the wives and relatives of Batten and the Tonstads hired helicopters at their own expense and continued to search the waters and the islands. They spent tens of thousands of dollars. The helicopters flew low over the reefs, the pilots scanning every white object on the shoals, every patch on the sand of the coral islets. No trace of the 3 men was found. No bodies, no fragments of clothing, no pieces of equipment. The Coral Sea gave nothing back. By the start of the summer of 2007, it had become clear that they would not be found alive. The question now was a different one. Could they at least establish what had happened to them and give the families the chance to put this chapter behind them? By that point, the international press had already dubbed the case. The Kaz 2 had become the ghost ship, the Australian Mary Celeste. Headlines appeared on the BBC, in The Guardian, and in Australian publications from Sydney to Perth. The white catamaran, with its engine running and deck empty, became one of the most recognizable images of the maritime mystery of the 21st century. But the journalist's interest lay not so much in finding an answer as in recreating the mystery. And the answer, if there was one at all, would have to be sought in the coroner's court. On the 4th of August 2008, 16 months after the crew's disappearance, an inquest began at the Townsville Coroner's Court. It was presided over by Queensland coroner Michael Barnes. He faced 3 questions. Were these people dead? Under what circumstances did they die? And had the search been conducted properly? Over the course of 4 days of hearings, the court heard from 27 witnesses. The official account, as set out by Coroner Barnes in his report, was as follows. On the morning of the 15th of April, at around 10 o'clock, the CAS 2 was sailing in the vicinity of George Point. Up to that point, everything had been fine. Over the next hour, the situation changed. The men hauled in a white rope that had been trailing behind the stern and laid it on the foredeck, possibly to dry. James Tanstead, for reasons unknown, took off his t-shirt and glasses and placed them on the back seat. As a fishing lure was found tangled in the port rudder, the coroner suggested that one of the Tanstead brothers had tried to free it and had fallen into the water. The second brother jumped in after him to help. Batten, left alone on board, started the engine and began to lower the sails in order to turn the catamaran round and return to the men who had fallen overboard. At that moment, the wind changed direction abruptly, and the boom, the horizontal beam to which the lower edge of the mainsail is attached, swinged across the deck and threw Batten overboard. 3 men found themselves in the water. None of them were strong swimmers. Peter Tanstead couldn't swim at all. The sea was rough, without life jackets or anything to keep them afloat, and with the waves growing stronger, they quickly became exhausted. The coroner described this sequence of events as a chain of misfortunes and ruled the deaths as accidental. The video footage itself was also presented during the preliminary inquiry. In addition to the technical details that the investigators used, a conversation could be heard on it. James Tanstead, who was holding the camera, and Batten were joking with Peter, who was sitting on the stern ladder with a fishing rod. Peter, who could not swim, was in the most vulnerable spot on the vessel, with the railing lowered, without a life jacket, above the water. And his companions were laughing, not out of cruelty, but out of that carefree attitude typical of people who do not yet know how the day will end. They discussed the sky ahead, which looked threatening, but did not consider it a sufficient reason to change anything. Several facts supported this version of events. The video footage confirmed that Peter Tanstead was fishing at the stern with the guardrail lowered and without a life jacket. The lure was indeed wrapped around the tiller. None of the 3 were wearing a life jacket in the video. The staysail was torn, which indicated strong winds or a sudden change in wind direction, and it was precisely such winds that could have caused the boom to move uncontrollably. Another factor contradicted this version of events. The state of the cabin did not fit with a scenario involving strong winds. If the gust had been strong enough to tear the sail and fling the boom with such force that a grown man was thrown overboard, why did the mug on the bench remain standing? Why did the newspaper on the table not budge? Critics pointed out that the scenario of 3 consecutive falls overboard was statistically unlikely. Each subsequent event in the chain would have had to occur within a very narrow time window. Otherwise, at least one of the men would have had time to react, put on a life jacket, send a distress signal, or activate the radio beacon. The coroner himself acknowledged the limitations of his findings. In his report, he stated explicitly that he could not be categorical about the circumstances surrounding the death. The theory of piracy, or an attack from another vessel, was one of the first to emerge. The fenders hanging on both sides suggested that another vessel had approached the cause too. The Great Barrier Reef region, despite its reputation as a tourist destination, is not free from crime. Fishing and cargo vessels operate here without strict supervision, and incidents involving yachtsmen and strangers in these waters have been recorded before. This theory was supported by the fenders and the fact that the interior remained largely undisturbed. If the crew had been taken off the ship by people who had approached in their own vessel, this would explain why everything was left in place. The people left, the belongings remained. Corey Benson, the first rescuer on board, admitted that his first instinct upon climbing onto the deck was precisely the fear of encountering an attacker. The facts contradicted the theory of piracy. The valuables were untouched. Wallets, passports, a rifle with ammunition, everything was in place. Forensic experts found not a single trace of an intruder, no fingerprints, no biological samples, and no damage typical of a forced entry. The Townsville police stated that the theory had not been substantiated. As the video footage showed, the fenders were still hanging on the fender rails when the vessel set sail, which most likely indicated simple forgetfulness on the part of the crew, rather than preparations for a rendezvous on the open sea. The possibility of an abnormal wave was also considered. In maritime terms, this is known as a killer wave, a single wave whose height significantly exceeds the average sea state in the area. It occurs when several wave systems coincide and is capable of crashing into a vessel without warning. Such a wave could have swept one or two people off the deck, after which a third person died whilst attempting to help. Experienced sailors commenting on the case noted that even in moderate swell of 15 to 20 knots, such a wave can take one by surprise, especially on a catamaran, whose design makes it resistant to heeling but vulnerable to being swamped over the stern. Meteorological records did not record any abnormal waves on that day, but as with tornadoes, the absence of a record does not mean the phenomenon did not occur. The theory that the disappearances were staged was treated as a formal obligation of the investigation. In all cases where bodies are not found, the police are obliged to check whether the disappearance was voluntary. The investigation examined the financial circumstances of all three men. None of them had significant debts, insurance policies for unusually high sums, or any other obvious motives. The families categorically rejected this theory. Jenny Tanstead, Peter's widow, pointed out that her husband would never have left his family of his own accord. No financial grounds for a staged disappearance were found, and the investigation closed this line of inquiry. There remained another set of theories which were difficult to classify as rational, but which nevertheless circulated in discussions of the case. Posts appeared on internet forums regarding sightings of unidentified objects in the Coral Sea region during that period. Anomalies were mentioned, linked to the proximity of the Great Barrier Reef and the peculiarities of the magnetic fields in that area. No evidence was presented to support such explanations, and the official investigation did not consider them. Between all these theories lay a gap that none of them fully filled. The official version explained how the men might have ended up in the water, but did not account for the orderliness of the cabin. The piracy version explained the order, but did not explain why the pirates would take the people and leave everything else behind. The staged incident version explained nothing apart from the very fact that the bodies were missing. Each explanation worked up to a certain point and then ran into a detail that contradicted it. On the 7th of August, 2008, Coroner Barnes delivered his verdict. The official cause of death was ruled as accidental. The document used the term misadventure, which in legal terms refers to death resulting from careless or reckless behavior, not involving criminal intent. The case was closed. For the families, the verdict was the conclusion they had been working towards for 16 months. Jenny Tansted, Peter's widow, publicly described the official version as the most plausible of all those considered. It was not so much agreement as acceptance. Of all the possible explanations, the coroners at least presented a picture in which the death was accidental rather than deliberate. Jennifer Batten, the skipper's wife, told the inquest how meticulously her husband had prepared for the voyage. Routes were plotted daily, courses discussed over dinner, and safety measures planned in advance. They had agreed not to sail at night and to stay close to the coast. She believed that Des was ready. Despite his diabetes, despite having suffered a heart attack, despite the fact that his experience was limited to 2 trips to the Whitsunday area. She believed because he believed. During the same questioning, Graham Douglas repeated what he had said. He had warned them. He had seen the 3 of them trying to learn their way around. He told them not to venture beyond the archipelago. They listened and left. The coroner also examined whether the search had been conducted properly. The inquest records noted a delay between the helicopter's first sighting of the catamaran on the 18th of April and the rescue team boarding the vessel on the 20th of April. For 2 days, the vessel continued to drift, whilst the crew, if any of them were still alive, remained without assistance. A separate issue concerned the vessel Jillian, which had sighted the CAS-2 as early as April 16th, but had failed to report it to the authorities. The coroner did not issue specific findings on these incidents, but the very fact that they were recorded in the inquest records suggested that the response system had not functioned flawlessly. Following the verdict, the case was classified as closed. The Queensland Police no longer took any active measures. Search operations were not resumed. The waters where the 3 men were presumed to have died returned to normal. Fishing boats, yachts, and Coast Guard vessels followed the same routes as they had before April 2007. Airlie Beach remained the same resort town from which dozens of boats set out for the reef every morning. Nothing in the harbor reminded one that a white catamaran had once set sail from here with 3 men on board who never returned. In the years that followed, there were no further developments in the CAS-2 case. The bodies were never found. Neither the currents nor the tides, nor any chance discoveries on the reef islands, yielded a single fragment that could be linked to the crew. The Coral Sea swallowed the 3 men whole, leaving no physical trace. But the story lived on in another realm. The CAS-2 became a fixture on lists of maritime mysteries, compilations of unexplained disappearances, and collections of ghost ships. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles in specialist maritime publications returned to the case time and again. Each new retelling added its own twist. Some versions emphasized the mystical: an empty vessel, a running engine, a laid table. Others focused on the human factor. 3 middle-aged men with minimal experience had set out to sea, ignoring warnings. Others drew parallels with the Australian thriller Dead Calm, filmed in 1989 in this very part of the Coral Sea, in which the yacht's crew encounters a stranger on a drifting vessel. The geographical coincidence lent the attack theory additional, albeit purely cinematic, weight. The comparison with the Mary Celeste became so firmly established that it became part of the case's identity. Any mention of the CAS-2 in the press was accompanied by this parallel. Yet there was one significant difference between the 2 cases, separated by 135 years. The Mary Celeste was found in an era when means of communication and navigation were primitive, when a ship could sail for weeks without contact with the shore, and when the crew's disappearance could be attributed to the limitations of technology. The CAS-2 disappeared in 2007. On board were GPS, a radio, and mobile phones, and none of these devices helped to establish what had happened. It was precisely this contrast between technological sophistication and the absolute impenetrability of the mystery that made the CAS-2 case so special. In an era when every move is tracked by satellites, 3 people managed to vanish as if electronics were irrelevant. Discussions on maritime forums have raged on for years. Experienced yachtsmen have scrutinized every detail of the situation on board, the position of the sails, the condition of the rigging, and the engine running in neutral. Some have concluded that the coroner's version, for all its far-fetched nature, remains the only explanation, consistent with the physical evidence. Others pointed to details that didn't add up. Why would Batten have started the engine if he was going to lower the sails? Why was the engine left in neutral rather than in gear? Each such question spawned a new thread of discussion, and none of them reached a definitive answer. The case has also attracted the attention of maritime safety experts. It has become a case study in discussions regarding the need for personal emergency beacons, which are attached to life jackets and activate automatically upon contact with water, as well as the rules on the mandatory wearing of life jackets when going on deck on the open sea. Had the men been wearing life jackets fitted with beacons, a signal would have been transmitted the moment they fell into the water, and the search would have begun within minutes, rather than 3 days later. The Cause 2 catamaran was subsequently sold. It changed hands and continued its life as an ordinary pleasure craft, without any commemorative plaques and with no connection to its own history. To its new owner, it was simply a boat. To everyone else, it remained a ghost ship forever. The Cause 2 case has been officially closed since August 2008. The verdict: death as a result of an accident. No new evidence has come to light. No further investigations have been carried out. 3 facts, however, remain unresolved. Firstly, not a single body was found. The Coral Sea, with all its currents and the activity of its marine life, does not always swallow things up without a trace. Remains, fragments of clothing, and personal belongings are washed ashore, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later. In the case of the Cause 2, nothing was found. Second, the situation on board did not fully correspond to any of the theories. It was too tidy for a storm, too undisturbed for an attack, and too sudden for a planned departure. Third, 3 people disappeared simultaneously from a vessel equipped with communication devices, none of which had been activated. The coroner gave an answer which he himself described as provisional. The sea gave no answer at all. The Coral Sea remains one of the most beautiful in the world. Turquoise waters, reefs, tropical islands on the horizon. Somewhere in these waters, at a point whose coordinates are known only approximately, in April 2007, something happened for which there is still no name. The currents continue to flow. The reefs continue to grow. And the 3 people who set out from Airlie Beach on that Sunday morning never made it back to shore. In June 2014, a 47-year-old Las Vegas resident named Kenny Veach left a comment under a video about Area 51. He wrote that during one of his hikes in the Mojave Desert, he found a cave with an entrance that looked like a perfect capital letter M. When he tried to go inside, his whole body began to vibrate, and the closer he got to the entrance, the stronger the vibration became. He got scared and ran away. The comment went viral. Some demanded proof, while others accused him of lying. Kenny returned to the desert, filmed a video, but couldn't find the cave. Subscribers mocked him. So, he promised to go back, this time with a pistol, adding, "If I don't come back, then I died doing what I love." On November 10th, 2014, Kenny Veach left his home and headed for the sheep range, deep in the heart of the Mojave Desert. 40 miles north of Las Vegas, with no roads, no trails, and no cell service, just scorching rock, abandoned mines without barriers, and a silence so heavy it makes your ears ring. 30 rescuers combed the area 3 times. A helicopter flew over the canyons. All they managed to find was his mobile phone, neatly placed on a rock at the entrance to a vertical mine shaft. What drove Kenny Veach on his final hike? Pressure from the internet? The thrill of exploration? Or a decision he made long before he left his house? Kenneth Lee Veach was born in 1967 in Las Vegas to a police officer. His father served on the city police force for 30 years. When Kenny was about 20, his father took his own life. This event would tear the family apart, and the rift would run through the rest of Kenny's life. He would feud with his brother Raymond for years, and the number of close people around him would dwindle. By age 46, Kenny lived alone in Las Vegas and ran a YouTube channel under a nickname he adopted after being bitten by a rattlesnake. The channel was small, videos from desert hikes, footage of abandoned mines, and encounters with wildlife. Kenny filmed tarantulas, desert tortoises, and bighorn sheep with massive curled horns. He caught snakes with his bare hands for fun and didn't hide it. For over 20 years, he went on solo hikes through the Mojave and Great Basin deserts. His style was deliberately ascetic. He refused to take a GPS, didn't use a compass, and didn't carry maps. He slept on mountain peaks under the open sky without a tent. He intentionally brought minimal water and food to, as he put it, test his limits. Once it nearly cost him his life. His left knee gave out on a trail. He had only 1 cup of water left for a 20-mile trek in temperatures over 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and he had to be evacuated by helicopter. But even after that, he didn't change his habits. Kenny didn't treat the desert as a place for a stroll, but as a space where he felt he belonged. In one video he said, "I hike mountain ranges where most people wouldn't dare to climb. I've been in so many caves I can't count them. I play with rattlesnakes for entertainment." About a year before he disappeared, Kenny quit his job. He decided to become an independent inventor. He developed a new model of a toilet paper holder, submitted it to the quirky platform, and tried to get on the TV show Shark Tank. Both times he was rejected. The money ran out and his savings were spent. He tried to sell his house under unusual terms, keeping the right to live in it as a handyman. No buyers were found. Kenny suffered from clinical depression. He refused to take medication and didn't see doctors. His girlfriend, Sherian Pilgrim, later said that he shared thoughts of suicide with her. Once, he told her that if he ever decided to go through with it, he would go so far into the desert that he would never be found. The sheep range stretches for about 56 miles across southern Nevada. It is part of the largest national wildlife refuge in the continental United States, the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, covering nearly 1.5 million acres. That is larger than the territory of some European countries. Despite its proximity to Las Vegas, the area is completely wild. There are no roads, no marked trails, no trash. The terrain consists of limestone canyons, where the walls narrow so much you can touch both sides at once, and vertical shafts of abandoned mines left over from the gold rush. The mines are neither fenced nor marked. A drop-off can open up right under your feet, just past a rock ledge. According to some reports, the military previously used some of these shafts to dump chemical waste. The area had another reputation. Nevada police had repeatedly found bodies there that were unrelated to tourism or accidents. To the west of the Sheep Range, past the Pintwater and Spotted Ranges, lies a testing and military training zone adjacent to Nellis Air Force Base. Area 51, located near Groom Lake, is by various estimates 32 to 128 kilometers from where Kenny hiked. The distance is significant, but for those following his story online, the proximity to a military facility would become a key element of future theories. It was here, in the Joe May Canyon area, that Kenny hiked most often. He knew this terrain better than most professional rescuers. In October 2014, after a wave of skeptical comments, Kenny set out on his second hike in search of the M Cave. He took a camera with him, filmed the entire route, and on October 18th, uploaded a video titled M Cave Hike. The footage shows him walking through canyons, bypassing vertical shafts, and encountering a black bighorn sheep on a slope. He didn't find the cave. Comments poured in under the video. Some wrote that he made it all up. Others demanded he go back. One comment stood out from the rest. A user wrote, "No, don't go back there. If you find the entrance to that cave, don't go inside. You won't come back out." Kenny replied to his subscribers that he would return, this time with a pistol. He said he would be better prepared. A few days before his final hike, Kenny typed a phrase into his browser's search bar: "Help me, help me, help me." The search history was saved on his computer. On November 10th, 2014, early in the morning, Kenny called Sherian. According to some reports, he was at a Las Vegas movie theater at the time. He said he was going on a short hike for 2 nights and 3 days. He didn't name the exact location. He didn't leave any coordinates. He got into his white Honda CR-V SUV and drove north to the familiar parking lot at the trailhead near Joe May Canyon. In the car, as usual, a cooler with beer for the trip back was waiting for him. But this time, he didn't take his video camera. He didn't take his GoPro. He didn't take the GPS navigator, which he hadn't used before anyway, but which at least stayed at home. He didn't take a hiking backpack, extra water, or food. Of all his things, he only had his mobile phone and a 9mm Ruger pistol. Sherian waited for his call after 3 days. The call didn't come. She called him herself. The phone didn't answer. She tried again, then again. Silence. A day passed, then a second. On November 17th, a week after he left, Sherian contacted the police. By that time, Kenny Veach had already been gone for 7 days. In the Mojave Desert in November, temperatures can rise above 86 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and drop to 32 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Without water or shelter, no one survives here for 7 days. On November 17th, 2014, when Sherian Pilgrim's report reached the Clark County Police, Kenny Veach had already been missing for a week. For the Mojave Desert, a week is the point after which the chances of finding a person alive drop to 0. The delay itself would later raise questions. Kenny left on November 10th, promising to return in 3 days. When he didn't answer calls on the 13th, Sherian began to worry but waited. She knew his habit of staying in the desert longer than planned and was used to the fact that there was no service in the mountains. Another day passed, then another. Only on the 17th did she go to the police. By then, a whole week had passed, and in those 7 days, the desert had done its work. The wind had erased tracks in open areas. The nightly temperature swings and daytime heat had accelerated the decomposition of all organic matter, and scavengers, from coyotes to vultures, are capable of completely destroying soft tissue on the surface within a few days. The police started by checking the usual routes. Sherian pointed out the area where Kenny usually parked his car and described his white Honda CR-V. A patrol found the vehicle in the parking lot at the trailhead near Joe May Canyon. The car was unlocked. Inside, on the back seat, was a cooler with beer, untouched. The keys, apparently, were with Kenny. Coordinators brought in Red Rock Search and Rescue, one of the most experienced volunteer units in the region. Dave Cummings took command of the operation. At the same time, official representatives of the state of Nevada joined the search. The problem was the territory. The sheep range is not a park with marked trails and stationary checkpoints. It is over 600 square miles of wild land, cut through by canyons and vertical drop-offs. Kenny could have gone in any direction. He left no route, no coordinates, and no note. The only lead was the area where his car was parked and Sherion's knowledge of where he usually hiked. The first search raid unfolded within a few days of the report. More than 30 people went into the desert in foot teams. K-9 units worked with them, dogs trained to track in dry, rocky terrain. A helicopter flew over the canyons, scanning open areas from the air. Rescuers divided the territory into squares and combed them methodically, sector by sector. Every canyon, every side ravine, every crevice was checked for traces: clothing, gear, footprints in the dirt. In the narrow limestone canyons, where the walls come together within arm's reach, the groups moved in single file. The sun flooded the upper edges of the cliffs, but down below, at the bottom of the canyons, lay cool shadows, and the sound of footsteps on gravel reflected off the walls with a short, dry echo. Vultures circled overhead. They always circle over these places, and their presence means nothing. But every time a bird descended, someone in the group would look up. Work proceeded from dawn till dusk. In November, nighttime temperatures dropped low enough to make being outdoors without gear dangerous. And the search teams knew that if Kenny was still alive and out there without shelter, he was running out of time. The mines presented a unique challenge. There are dozens in the area, and most aren't on any map. Vertical shafts dozens of feet deep can be hidden behind a rock ledge or scree, and you might only spot them when you're right on top of them. Peering into everyone, checking everyone, that's a job that, in this terrain, stretches on for weeks. There were no results. Not a boot print, not a scrap of fabric, not a scent for the dogs to pick up and follow. The first sweep ended without a single lead. A second outing was organized. Then a third. Each time the searchers expanded the perimeter, moving further from the car and checking increasingly remote sections of the ridge. A helicopter made another pass. The dogs worked from the parking area deeper into the territory, trying to detect any direction the man might have moved. Dave Cummings, who led the operations, later described the situation briefly. They tracked Kenny's route as far as they could, but past a certain point, the tracks vanished completely. In the desert, rocky ground doesn't hold prints well, and in a week, the wind can erase even the ones that remain. On November 22nd, the 12th day after Kenny disappeared, the search team found his mobile phone. It was lying on a rock, not in a crevice, not in the dust, not among rock debris. On a rock, in plain sight, about a 4-hour hike from where the car was parked. Next to the phone was the open entrance to a deep vertical shaft of an abandoned mine. Kenny knew this shaft. He had filmed it at the beginning of his October video, M-Cave Hike. He walked up to the edge, looked down, and commented on its depth. In the footage, you can see him standing right at the brink, the camera looking into the void, its walls plunging vertically into the darkness. Rusty rock debris sticks out of the ground around it like teeth. The coordinates of the find match the coordinates of the shaft from the video. It was the very spot he passed every time he set out in search of this M-Cave. For the searchers, it meant one thing. Kenny had returned to a familiar place. He hadn't gotten lost or wandered off course. He had come specifically here, to a shaft he knew, and where he had stopped. The searchers lowered specialized cameras into the shaft. The equipment allowed them to inspect the bottom and the walls at the full depth. The cameras found no human remains, no clothing fragments, no gear, and no signs of a recent rockfall. The shaft was empty. Cummings commented on the find with restraint. He said they had found the phone next to an old vertical shaft and couldn't find any other traces. According to him, this didn't mean Kenny was at the bottom of the shaft, but the searchers had tracked his movements as far as it was humanly possible. The dogs were brought to the phone. They tried to pick up a trail from that point in any direction. There was no trail. Not toward the canyons, not back to the car, not deeper into the desert. The man had walked to this rock, placed his phone on it, and stopped leaving tracks. This was the first oddity, but not the last. The position of the phone didn't look accidental. It hadn't been dropped. It hadn't fallen out of a pocket, and it wasn't lying in the dust. It was lying on a rock, on a flat surface, right in front of the entrance to a shaft that Kenny knew well and had filmed a month earlier. It looked like a deliberate act, to set it down carefully and walk away. But walk away where? The dogs couldn't find a direction. In a rocky desert where the ground is so dry and hard that it barely holds prints, that's understandable. But there was nothing else with the phone. No pistol, no backpack, no personal belongings of any kind. The 9mm Ruger that Kenny had taken with him on this hike wasn't found near the shaft, inside it, or anywhere in the searched territory. A metal pistol, unlike soft tissue, doesn't decompose or disappear. Coyotes and vultures, capable of destroying biological remains on the desert surface in a matter of days, are indifferent to metal. If Kenny had died somewhere in the open, the pistol should have remained. It wasn't found. When investigators examined Kenny's computer, the picture became more detailed, but no clearer. The browser history contained a search query made a few days before his final hike. "Help me, help me, help me." 3 times in a row, on one line, with no punctuation. It could have been a cry for help addressed to a search engine instead of a living person. It could have been song lyrics or a random string of words. The context in which the query was made remained unknown. Parallel to the official investigation, the internet began forming its own version of events. Subscribers to Kenny's channel noticed his absence. Videos stopped appearing. The comments under M Cave Hike filled with questions. Where is he? What happened? Did he find the cave? When the first news of his disappearance broke, the discussion spilled over onto Reddit, into podcasts, and into thematic communities dedicated to unsolved cases. It was then that a message appeared in the comments under Kenny's video from a user identifying herself as Sherion Pilgrim, his girlfriend. Sherion confirmed that Kenny was missing. She described the circumstances. He went on a hike, didn't return. Search teams combed the area 3 times and found only the phone by the shaft. But before moving to conclusions, she talked about what he was like in the desert. They hiked together, sometimes for 9 hours a day, exploring abandoned mining towns that tourists in Nevada call ghost towns, and descending into caves and mines. They always prepared thoroughly. They wore snake guards, protective clothing against the sun, took walking sticks, and extra water and food, and they always left an additional supply in the car for the trip back. Kenny was more cautious than he seemed in his videos, where he played with rattlesnakes. On real hikes, he knew what he was doing. And then Sherion wrote something that would turn the discussion upside down. "I don't think Kenny had an accident. I believe he committed suicide." According to her, Kenny had been battling depression for years and refused any help. He didn't take medication. He didn't see doctors. Being fired, the failure of his inventions, and financial ruin had pushed him to a point where he stopped seeing a way out. Sherion said she had asked him directly if he was capable of taking his own life. His father had passed away that exact way, and she wanted to know. Kenny told her that if he ever decided to do it, he would go so far into the desert that no one would ever find him. Sherion was convinced he had left the phone intentionally so he couldn't be tracked by its signal. For the same reason, she believed, he hadn't taken his camera. There was nothing to film because he wasn't planning on returning from this hike. This explanation formed a coherent picture. Depression, financial ruin, refusal of treatment, the phrase about not being found, the abandoned phone, the lack of a camera and GPS. Every element pointed in one direction, but this picture had gaps. If Kenny planned to end his life in the desert, Why did he tell his subscribers he would return with proof? Why promise to take a pistol and find the cave? Why leave comments fueling the intrigue around the M cave until the very last day? A person who has decided to die usually doesn't create public commitments for the future. Or do they? Because that's exactly what makes a cover story convincing. And one more question that never found an answer. If Kenny's body is somewhere in the desert, on the surface, or at the bottom of one of the countless shafts, why has not a single fragment been discovered in all the years since? Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing, not the metal pistol, which isn't subject to decay. The Mojave Desert, for all its vastness, is not unpopulated. Tourists, hunters, and military patrols pass through these areas regularly. Dozens of enthusiasts have purposefully combed the area for traces since Kenny's disappearance. Nothing. Meanwhile, opinions within Kenny's family were divided. Sherian was convinced of suicide, but Kenny's brother Raymond and his sister-in-law, Susan Veach, held a completely different view. They didn't believe Kenny was dead, and a person identifying himself online as a relative named Michael Veach went even further. He accused Sherian of emotional pressure on Kenny and claimed that she was the one who drove him to despair. The police, he said, refused to take the family's request for an investigation into a possible crime seriously. The family, which had been split by a years-long feud between the brothers even before the disappearance, was now even more deeply divided. Each side was certain they were right. Each side blamed the other, and neither had any proof. After 3 ground search operations and 1 helicopter sweep, the authorities shut down the active phase of the search. The exact date isn't recorded in open sources, but it happened between late November and December 2014, when it became clear that there were no new leads, and the area had been exhausted. The case was entered into the federal NamUs Missing Persons database. Kenny was assigned an identification number, and the status, presumed dead. The wording meant that the investigation had no grounds to consider him alive, but also no direct evidence of death. The body hadn't been found. The cause of the disappearance hadn't been established. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't being actively pursued. It had moved into the category law enforcement calls a cold case. Forensic experts and police considered several avenues simultaneously. A lost hiker, a fall into an unexplored shaft, or suicide driven by depression. None of the versions received enough confirmation to close the case. According to available data, the police did analyze his computer. However, according to some family members, digital evidence from the phone wasn't collected in full, and requests from relatives for a deeper investigation into a possible crime were rejected. According to the person identifying as Michael Veach, the police told the family directly, "Kenny is dead in a ravine. Stop calling." For those who knew Kenny, this was a turning point. The hope that he was alive, that he was lost somewhere, that he had just lost contact and was about to emerge onto a road, that hope was gone. Not because evidence of his death had appeared, but because there was no one left to search and nowhere left to look. The search camp was dismantled. The equipment was hauled away. The grid squares on the map, which 30 people had combed through for weeks, became just patches of desert once again. Within a couple of days, the wind had buried the last of the searchers' boot prints under sand and dust. The Sheep Range Canyon returned to silence. The white Honda CR-V was removed from the parking area. The cooler with beer in the back seat remained untouched. There was nothing left on the rock at the mine entrance. The phone was taken by the police. The desert keeps no records. The sand fills in footprints within hours. The wind levels everything that was pressed into the ground, and the sun burns any organic matter into dust. A month after the disappearance, there was not a single sign left in the area that anyone had been searched for there. As if there had been no 30 searchers, no helicopter, no dogs. As if Kenny himself had never existed. When the active search ended and the case was moved to the cold case category, theories began to crystallize around Kenny Veach's disappearance. Each of them relied on real facts, and each had its own weak points. The first and most thoroughly substantiated theory belonged to Sherry-Ann Pilgrim. In her conviction, Kenny committed suicide. The arguments she presented formed a consistent chain. Long-term, untreated clinical depression, refusal of medication, and doctor visits. His father's suicide, which Kenny experienced at age 20, and which by all appearances left a deep mark on him. Financial ruin, being fired, failed inventions, and an attempt to sell his house under impossible conditions. The search query, "Help me, help me, help me," in his browser a few days before he left. And most importantly, Kenny's own direct words that if he ever decided to do it, he would go so far into the desert that he would never be found. Sherry-Ann drew attention to what Kenny did not take with him on his final hike. His video camera and GoPro were left at home. He hadn't used a GPS or compass before, but he always took his camera when he planned to film. If he was going to look for the M cave, why leave the camera behind? The answer, in Sharon's opinion, was simple. He wasn't planning on filming anything. She interpreted the phone left on the rock by the mine as a conscious step to cut off the last channel through which he could be tracked. Critics of this theory pointed to several gaps. The first, the complete absence of a body or any physical remains. In the Mojave Desert, soft tissue does indeed decompose quickly, especially if scavengers get to it. But bones, teeth, metal clothing components, and weapons remain for years. The 9mm Ruger that Kenny took with him was not found in any of the checked mines or on the surface. Over the course of more than 10 years, dozens of enthusiasts have combed the area, and no one has found anything. The second gap, Kenny's behavior before his disappearance. He was actively writing to his subscribers, promising to return with proof, and making plans for a third trip. People who have made the decision to end their lives can behave in different ways, but creating public commitments for the future is rare. However, proponents of the suicide theory countered, this is exactly what makes the cover-up convincing. Promises and plans create the illusion of an intention to return. The second theory, death by the elements or an accident. Kenny could have died from dehydration, heat stroke, hypothermia during the night, or by falling into one of the countless vertical mine shafts scattered across the sheep range. The terrain in these parts does not forgive mistakes. A drop-off can be hidden behind a rock ledge, and even an experienced hiker walking at dusk or distracted for a second risks stepping into the void. Kenny, for all his experience, fundamentally did not use navigation, intentionally took minimal water, and had already found himself on the verge of death in these same mountains once before. This theory would well explain the disappearance, if not for one detail, the phone. A person who dies by accident does not place their phone on a rock by a familiar mine. They drop it, leave it in their pocket, or lose it during a fall. A phone neatly placed in a conspicuous spot is an action, not an accident. Proponents of the accident theory countered, the phone could have been left for another reason. For example, Kenny could have drained the battery and placed it by a notable landmark to retrieve it on his way back. Or he could have left it consciously as a marker of his route before heading into an unfamiliar area. And then, something went wrong. The third theory was the most popular on the internet, though the least supported by facts: military intervention. According to this theory, Kenny stumbled upon a secret entrance to an underground facility connected to Nellis Air Force Base, or Area 51, and was eliminated. Conspiracy theorists pointed to two facts. The first, the proximity of Kenny's hiking area to the testing and military training zones. The second, the symptoms he described when approaching the M cave. a vibration of the entire body, increasing as he approached the entrance, and a sudden, inexplicable fear. In the opinion of this theory's supporters, the description exactly matched the effects of infrasonic weapons used by the military for crowd control. Such devices generate low-frequency sound waves, inaudible to the human ear, but which cause nausea, vibration of internal organs, and acute panic. Critics pointed to a number of weak points. Area 51 is located near Groom Lake, 28 to 80 miles from the places where Kenny hiked, and is separated from them by the territory of a national wildlife refuge. Military patrols in the territory adjacent to the testing zone operate openly. Trespassers are detained, fined, and escorted out, but not killed. Not a single confirmed case of the physical elimination of a civilian in the vicinity of Area 51 has ever been recorded. As for the vibration, there was a perfectly scientific explanation for it. Old, unventilated mines and caves in limestone can accumulate carbon dioxide, displacing oxygen. A person entering such a space begins to experience hypoxia, dizziness, nausea, a sensation of vibration in the body, which in medicine is called paresthesia, and a sudden, irrational fear. All the symptoms described by Kenny fit the clinical picture of oxygen deprivation. The sensation was real. Its source could have been completely mundane. The fourth theory was the most unexpected: a staged disappearance. According to this, Kenny Veach did not die, but invented the M cave, faked his disappearance, and went into hiding to escape debts, start a new life, or collect an insurance payout. The main source of this theory was Kenny's sister-in-law, Susan Veach. She claimed that in 2018, 4 years after the disappearance, Kenny broke into her store and stole a tablet. According to her, he was limping on a bad left knee, and the entire scene was recorded by a security camera. Kenny's daughter, upon seeing the recording, initially confirmed that it was her father in the video. Later, she retracted her statement. Proponents of this theory pointed out that Kenny possessed survival skills in the desert, knew the territory well, and theoretically could have planned an exit route, leaving the phone as a false trail. Critics countered. Kenny was registered in the federal NamUs database as a missing person and declared presumed dead. A staging of this scale would have required a complete abandonment of his former identity, documents, and connections. For a person in a financial crisis, without savings and without support, this would have been technically extremely difficult. Furthermore, Kenny was neither a fugitive from justice, nor the holder of large insurance policies, nor involved in anything worth running from. He was an unemployed hiker with an empty bank account and a YouTube channel with a few hundred subscribers. There was one more detail that didn't fit well into any of the theories. The warning. That very comment left by an unknown user under the October video. Don't go back there. If you find the entrance to that cave, don't go in. You won't come back out. The comment could have been a joke, an attempt to stir up fear, a provocation, or something the author knew more about than they were letting on. The identity of this user was never established. None of the four theories explained all the facts simultaneously. Each had a gap where logic fell through. The suicide theory didn't explain the absence of the body and the pistol. The accident theory didn't explain the neatly placed phone. The military intervention theory had not a single piece of direct evidence. The staging theory rested on the testimony of one person, which a key witness later retracted. After 2014, the case of Kenny Veach did not disappear. It ceased to be an investigation and became a legend. Official searches were not resumed. The Clark County Police did not allocate new resources, did not conduct repeat sweeps, and did not order additional forensic examinations. The case remained in the NamUs database with its previous status: missing, presumed dead, No updates. But the internet did not forget. Comments under Kenny's videos continued to accumulate. On Reddit, in communities dedicated to cold cases and missing persons, discussions of his story popped up periodically. Users analyzed every frame of his videos, checked coordinates, plotted routes on maps, and argued about geology and the gas composition of caves. Podcasts returned to the case again and again. Astonishing Legends, Generation Y, the Nevada Triangle. Each time the same facts were retold, new interpretations were added, and old contradictions were discussed. There was an irony in this. Kenny Veach, in his lifetime, was a little-known YouTuber with a small audience. His channel didn't make money, his videos got modest views, and his comment about the M Cave was taken by many as a fabrication. But it was the disappearance that turned him into a figure discussed by millions. Kenny's story became part of the established canon of internet mysteries, alongside the Dyatlov Pass and the Mary Celeste, the very internet that had mocked him and demanded proof while he was alive, turned him into a legend after he vanished. Sherian continued to appear in the comments. She asked people not to risk their lives trying to find the M Cave. She repeated her theory. Kenny committed suicide. She asked to be left alone. Her pleas went unheard. Years after his disappearance, enthusiasts began appearing in the sheep range, following in Kenny's footsteps. They would upload his videos, cross-reference coordinates with maps, plot an approximate route, and head into the desert to search for the M Cave. Some filmed their treks and posted them on YouTube. Dozens of videos, dozens of attempts, and not a single one led to a result that could be considered definitive. One such seeker, a YouTuber named Sean, followed Kenny's route and discovered a rock formation that resembled an M-shaped entrance. The opening was low, no more than 5 feet high, and partially blocked by rocks. Sean reported that as he approached the spot, he felt a sudden, intense physical nausea. He vomited. He caught it all on camera. Whether this was a psychosomatic reaction tied to expectations and nervous tension, or if he truly encountered the same phenomenon Kenny described, remains unknown. Meanwhile, unidentified human remains continued to be found in the Mojave Desert. Each time it sparked a wave of discussion. Could it be Kenny? In November 2024, Clark County Police discovered a male skeleton. Forensic analysis determined the deceased stood between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 2 inches. Kenny was 5 feet 8 inches. The skeleton was ruled out. A year later, in November 2025, a human skull was found. Beside it lay bones with fur, which upon inspection turned out to be non-human, belonging to an animal. The skull also did not match Kenny's records. Each such discovery briefly revived hope for an answer, only to extinguish it just as quickly. The desert regularly returned remains to the surface, but among them, there were never any that could close the case. In 2018, Kenny's story took an unexpected turn. A daughter-in-law of Susan Veach claimed she saw him alive in her store. According to her, he burst in, grabbed a tablet, and ran out, limping on his left knee. A security camera captured the incident. Kenny's daughter watched the footage and initially confirmed. It was her father on the video. Later, she retracted that statement. The episode was never confirmed or refuted. As far as is known, the police did not conduct a separate investigation into it. For some, it became proof that Kenny is alive. For others, it was just another manifestation of grief, which causes people to see missing relatives and strangers. On November 28, 2021, an episode of the TV show Real Life Nightmare on HLN was dedicated to the Kenny Veach case. The story moved beyond internet forums and onto broadcast television. Horror filmmakers took notice as well. The movie Horror in the High Desert, filmed in the found footage genre, is partially based on his story. But no documentary, no podcast, and no TV show brought the answer any closer. They only multiplied the questions. In the time between these events, people who might have known more than others passed away. Kenny's mother, his brother Raymond, and his nephew Sean all died between 2020 and 2023. None of them ever found out what happened on November 10th, 2014. To this day, the Kenny Veach case remains open. His file is active in the NAMU's database. The status has not changed. Missing, presumed dead. No further official searches are being conducted, but anyone who discovers remains or items in the Sheep Range area can report them using the case file number. Enthusiast hikers still head out on the routes Kenny blazed. They download his videos, check the landmarks, and search for the M Cave. Some want to solve the mystery. Others want to experience what he experienced. The vibration, the fear, the sensation of something that has no name. Still others just want to rack up views. The Mojave Desert, meanwhile, does not change. The Sheep Range stands where it always has. The canyons narrow just as they did 10 years ago. The mines drop vertically into the earth, without fences or warnings. Bighorn sheep with massive horns climb the slopes. Tarantulas cross the rocky scree, and vultures circle in the rising currents of warm air. Nothing here has changed. Somewhere in this territory, a 4-hour hike from the parking lot where a white SUV once sat with a cooler of beer in the back seat, there is a rock. A rock upon which a mobile phone lay on November 22nd, 2014. Next to the rock is a vertical mine shaft, descending into the darkness. Kenny Veach walked past this shaft in October, filmed it, and kept going. In November, he returned to it, left his phone, and walked away. Where he went, no one knows.